Who is jumping on the wagons? Who is doing the work in this country? They're all Irishmen. Every one of them. They're Irish contractors and they're Irish labour. Who built the road at the Nag's Head? John Murphy, a man from Dingle in the County Kerry. That was the man that put it through there with Irish labour. And I've heard Englishmen to say, and English women, my God, are they not savage?
I've won a hero's name with McAlpine and Costain, with Fitzpatrick, Murphy, Ash and Wimpy's gang. I've been often on the road on me way to draw the dole, when there's nothing left to do for Johnny Lang. And I used to think that God made the mixer pick and hod, so that Paddy might know hell above the ground. I've had gangers big and tough tell me tear it all out rough, when you're building up and tearing England down. Fáilte Rova Cárja, Fáilte Isteach to episode 7 of Undercover Irish. In today's episode, we're going to go and look at a concept I mentioned in an earlier episode that was Let Erin Remember, where we take a ballad or a song or a piece of music and we use that ballad or that song or that piece of music as a lens to look at history. And specifically today, we're going to look at social history. What can a song tell us? And in this case, what can building up and tearing England down, or Paddy on the Road as it was originally termed, what can it tell us about the time that it was written in? What can it tell us about today? And what can it tell us about the time before that song was written? This is a history of the people that song was written about, and this is a history of the people who came before and indeed after it. So I hope you enjoy this episode of Undercover Irish Cárja. I mentioned in a previous podcast the quote by Frank Hart: "Those in power write the history, while those who suffer write the songs." I didn't give the second part of the quote, but the second part of the quote is, "And given our history, we have an awful lot of songs." So there's a little bit of black humour inside in that. But I want to kind of build on that and give my rationale for using a ballad or a song or a piece of music as a historical reference point. Like, what is a ballad, first of all? A ballad, like, it's a narrative song or it's a poem that tells a story. And traditionally, it's passed down orally. Now, this is really important to us and our history as Irish people, because for so long, our history was passed on ovail, gavail, from mouth to mouth, and the same for music and songs. Ballads use generally simple language, simple words. They normally have strong rhythms, repetition, and it makes them easy to remember and easy to share. This was perfect, obviously, for a time back in the day when people couldn't read or write. It was perfect in a culture or in a country or where maybe literacy or illiteracy was an issue. And it ensured that the songs and the history of people, the stories of people, were kept alive from generation to generation, or ogluin go gluin. So ballads are the people's history. Now, they're unofficial histories, right? They're told by the voices from below. They're told from the bottom of society up. They don't reflect the perspectives of governments. They don't reflect the perspectives of the rich and the powerful normally. Ballads capture what ordinary people think and what ordinary people experienced. Sometimes it's sad, sometimes it's humorous, sometimes it's celebratory. But ballads songs also capture emotion that textbooks can't access. If you think about it, right? If we open a book in a library, or if we open an academic book in particular, the book itself, the paper, might be full of rich and important history. But often the emotion or the feeling of the time or the feeling of the people doesn't come through the words or the pages of the book or the paper. But with song and with music, it's absolutely the opposite. So while the ballad and the song might not necessarily be academically sound or academically solid, and of course often the balladeer or the songwriter will use a bit of a poetic license in terms of stretching the truth. What they do capture is the feeling and the emotion of history, of a setting, of a society, or of a social moment. Now, ballads and songs might not always be strictly factual, but they're emotionally honest. Like, they convey how people feel about events, grief, pride, rage, betrayal, and all the feelings that can tell us about any period or any time. They preserve marginalised histories. Ballads preserve the experiences of workers, rebels, migrants, women, sometimes people who are ignored by textbooks or on the margin of the textbooks. So they're an extremely powerful vessel for us. The repetition, the simple structure, the melody, and sometimes a personal narration as well. They give you a human face to the history. They embed the story in culture. They allow people of all literacy levels to understand it and pass it on. They make the story memorable and they spread it easily. And these songs are often sang at gatherings, protests, and even funerals. And why do they matter today? Well, for centuries, ballads have been living archives. They tell us how events were experienced at the ground level. They tell us what people cared about, what they feared, what they celebrate, and what official history might ignore or distort. They provide a counterbalance to that. And all of that is certainly true with what we're using today as our reference point, building up and tearing England down. If you are familiar with the song, it's probably because it's come back to prominence thanks to the fantastic Mary Wallopers, who have brought it to popularity in what is kind of another folk revival happening at the moment. And I'll return to the Mary Wallopers later in the podcast and their version. But first, let's look at the history of the song itself. The song was written by Dominic Behan. That's the younger brother of Brendan Behan. And like Brendan, Dominic was political, he was poetic and fiercely proud of his working class background. He wrote the song in the 1960s and it was first recorded by a young Christy Moore in 1969 on an album called Paddy on the Road, which we will look at in just a second. But the song itself is basically an anthem of the Irish navvy in London and indeed England, broader than that, England and beyond. Because what's happening at that time is a construction drive or a post-war boom between the 1950s and the 1970s. And there's a roll call in the very first verse of the song of the major contractors, McAlpine, Costain, Wimpey and Lang. These firms relied heavily on Irish migrant labour. The jobs ranged from motorway flyovers to building new lines on the underground, like, for example, the new Victoria line, which is explicitly mentioned. And the song kind of deals with the conditions, or puts forward the conditions that Irish navvy workers would have faced in London, in England and beyond. There's the hint at the casualisation, or what was called the lump, with the mention of the ganger man. So this verse, the last verse, hints out at the lump labour scheme. So this was basically where you worked cash in hand. You worked day to day. It was a hiring system that stripped builders and labourers of holiday pay, of sick pay, of insurance cover. There was the mention, of course, of the dangerous work and the high mortality. So the song mentions the death of a young Limerick man found built into the new Victoria line. Now, while that might be a fictional account, again harking back to how maybe ballads sometimes take poetic license, fatal accidents were grimly common. You had collapses, you had gas explosions, you had falls in building sites. This was a relatively common occurrence. So the work was difficult and dangerous. And that particular Victoria line myth, that bodies lay entombed in London's concrete, it became a kind of a shorthand, a kind of a folk shorthand for the lethal risks that navvies faced and the fact that there was scant official concern for any fatal accidents. Oral history interviews, they record like 12-hour shifts, little safety gear, and a threat of instant dismissal for anyone who was uncooperative for any particular reason. The song also kind of hints at the precarity of the work and the fact that you were in and out of work all the time and the dole was always on the horizon. When he says, I was often on the road on my way to draw the dole when there's nothing left to do for Johnny Lang. Building could be seasonal, so a lot of the labour work was seasonal. And between motorway contracts, a navvy might hitch south to Kent or even maybe go back to Ireland for a while to sustain themselves because of the intermittent work. This lyric captures the cycle of boom and bust that dominated the life of the navvy. The song also kind of conveys that feeling of being an outsider. The song uses paddy as a kind of a reference for all Irish people working in Britain, and all navvies certainly. And this would have been a term of insult. This would have been a stereotypical term labelled on Irish workers abroad. Now this is, Britain at the time of the signs, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. The mixture of dependence and disdain shaped the community's sense of outsider solidarity. Because within this culture, within this time, within this framework, the Irish created their own solidarity within areas like Cricklewood, Kilburn and Camden. The song also has a kind of a dark humour or a black humour or a fatalist humour within it. Dominic Behan catalogues a load of grisly deaths and grisly accidents. There's Pat McCann's fall. There's Old Balls McCall into a mixer. It's delivered with kind of a gallows wit. Now, why would you do this? Well, looking into this, right, scholars argue that humour like this, it performs or it serves two social functions. Number one, it's a coping mechanism, right? It's a coping mechanism for the world, where showing fear, could invite ridicule. And the second is it's myth making. It creates myths. It creates the heroic image, which is celebrated, but also a stereotype of Irish builders within Britain.
And there was a time here, which I wanted to say, and I will say it, that it was wrote up on the boards, no Irish need apply. And you left Ireland. You were forced with your own country people. You had to leave Ireland because we were big families. There was nothing in it. It was poor. It's destitute. Sorry to have to say this, destitute. It's the best country in the world. And they're the greatest people in the world. There's no doubt about it. I mean to say, they've proved themselves the best people in the world. They went to the States, they've made good. They went to France, they've made good. But they won't make good in England. Because from the time they start in England, they're not wanted.
And returning to Christy Moore's version of this from 1969 on Paddy on the Road, have a listen to it if you can. It's very much in keeping with that dark humour, that, that denial almost of the realities. Because while the lyrics they detail some very, very deep and dark things, Christy's version of it is upbeat, it's chirpy, it's cheeky. And when you think about it, this isn't surprising because he's singing that song in 1969 at the time when all of this is happening. So he's playing to the navvies in the pubs, he's playing around Britain and indeed Ireland, playing this song to an audience that are experiencing the hardship of tough work, tough labour, uncertain jobs and poor living conditions. So in order to deliver the message, it's delivered as a kind of a funny thing. It's delivered as a kind of a joke. It's upbeat, it's up-tempo, it's chirpy. It's the opposite of what the lyrics and the experience actually is, which is a very interesting kind of a social comment. The fact that at the time when he's singing the song, he sings it in an upbeat fashion as a kind of an escape. And that's exactly what it is. It's an escapism. Now, one of the beautiful things about using music or ballads as a historical reference point is that no two versions of any song are the same. Even if you go to see the same artist 2 nights in a row, the song will sound slightly different both times. And that's certainly the case with the Mary Wallopers version of it. Now, again, you have to take the context into consideration here. The Mary Wallopers recorded their version in the modern era, generations after the high point of the Irish navvy in Britain. So they can more freely investigate the themes of the songs and look at it through a much more melancholic lens. And that's exactly what they did. They've included the voice of navvies in their recording. They've slowed it way down. And they're singing the exact same lyrics as Christy Moore sang in 1969. But this time, thanks to the passage of time, they have the freedom to really express the feeling of the history of the ballad, of the song, of what it's trying to say. Because now, of course, when we look back on that history, we can acknowledge how difficult and how tough and how hard that time was for Irish workers, for Irish migrant labourers in particular. And unfortunately as well, we get to see that not all of those stories ended in a happy way. The 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, many of the navvies, the Irish navvies, who had worked day to day on the lump, who had worked in jobs without union protection, who had worked in cash in hand jobs, ended up with destitution, ended up with, social problems, ended up with personal problems, and ended up in a situation where the promise of gold on the streets of London certainly didn't materialise for them. And the Mary Wallopers version, like I said, captures that emotion. It brings forward that feeling, and it brings a kind of a different lens that we can look through in 2025 as opposed to Christy Moore's version in 1969. Goes without saying, both versions are fantastic, they're brilliant, but it's really good to compare and contrast the two of them, because the exact same song, the exact same lyrics give a completely different feeling. And at this point, we return to what exactly a navvy is. This is the paddy in the song. Well, he's a labourer. He's digging out roads, tunnels, railways, sewers. And the word comes from navigator, because these were the men who built canals originally. This is a really important context for the next point I'm going to make, because the generation of the 50s and the 60s, this wasn't new, the experience of Irish migrant labour, because many of them had been making the journey from the mid-1800s onwards, particularly after Undrohail, on Gurt the Moor. Their wages, right, the wages of these people were low, the work was dangerous, many died in silence, away from home, unnamed, and kind of forgotten about. Now, the tragedy wasn't just that they left. The tragedy is that they had to. After independence, the Irish Free State didn't stop the hemorrhage of people, as the promises of the revolution promised. If anything, they kept the door open. And this is a crucial point, because the Free State, certainly, especially in its earliest years, maintained the situation that Ireland had as a colony of Britain. Ireland was to be a source of cheap labour. Ireland was to be a source of cheap food for Britain. So the navvy that we see in the song had to leave. And they left again and again and again, generation after generation. And the state looked the other way. This was Ireland's dirty secret. And their pain was exported along with their bodies. And it's that tragedy that I think the Mary Wallopers captured so effectively, because obviously decades have passed. This version is slower, it's sadder, it's more haunting. They took the original lyrics, they stripped them of their bounce, and they turned it into a kind of a lament. And by using the words of former navvies in the song, they gave them a voice in history. They documented it in musical history. The broken bodies, so in some cases, the wasted lives. There's no punchline. And time does that. It lets the emotion breathe. It shows us that this wasn't just satire. It was trauma. So Christy sang it, obviously, to an audience with clenched fists, because they were enduring it. They were going through it. They were escaping from it. but the Mary Wallopers sing it with bowed heads. So who profited from all of this? Who are the beneficiaries of all of this? The final verse says it quite clearly, and it serves as a warning in that time. It says, "Come all ye navvies bold, who think that English gold is just waiting to be taken from each sod. The likes of you and me will never get an OBE or a knighthood for good service to the Hod. They've a concrete master race to keep you in your place, and a ganger man to kick you to the ground if you ever try to take part of what the bosses make when you're building up and tearing England down." And history would prove that warning largely correct in terms of a warning to workers and to navvies and to labourers. You know, when we look at the firms mentioned in the song, and you look at their list of achievements, they're credited with building all of these fantastic infrastructural projects. But nowhere except for ballads and songs do we see Irish labour, or indeed any other migrant labour, credited with what they achieved with their hands, with their blood and with their sweat. Secondly, you know, the idea of workers trying to take part of what the bosses make. Essentially what we're talking about there is workers looking for, you know, their labour to be compensated according to their value. In other words, looking for pay rises, looking for insurance, looking for holiday pay, sick pay, benefit. And, you know, in the case of McAlpines, Robert McAlpine, or Concrete Bob, as his nickname was, you know, they were embroiled in several scandals around blacklisting. In other words, blacklisting labourers or workers who were prepared to ask for better pay, who were prepared to organise and attempting to unionise and look for their rights as labour, as their rights as human beings, their rights as part of what was being created at the time. Now, if Concrete Bob and the bosses, as described in the song, profited and were the beneficiaries of this, who lost out? Now, an editorial in the Sun newspaper in Britain in the 80s leads as follows. The headline is "Home Truth," and here's the quote from the article. "A quarter of the homeless in London are from the Irish Republic. A report calls for even more of your money to help them. Why not just pay their fare back to the Emerald Isle? The pavements of Dublin are no less comfortable than London's." End of the quote. So what we see there, Akarja, is once it's been used, once it's of no more use, migrant labour loses its civil rights, its human rights, and it's used and abused and dispensed with. Now, Akarja, in my view, in my opinion, we should look at that and we should take heed of that in the day that is today. We should remember that as some of the world events that are falling out around us and around us are going on. But Akarja, I feel that it would be wrong to leave the story simply at that. Yeah, the story is extremely melancholic. It is very evocative and it's very, very powerful, and it captures the experience beautifully of navvies, sometimes with dark humour, but of the navvy generation in Britain. But of course, despite the fact that the last verse is very fatalistic, it's very negative almost in one sense, very powerful but maybe negative, it is important to remember that it is very, very possible for the workers to get part of what the bosses make. Because the lump system that I described earlier on, in other words, building workers working day to day, working cash in hand, which was the norm at the time of the 50s and 60s in Britain. Of course, this was defeated and overrun by a 12-week strike in 1972, a national builders' strike, where building workers in Britain, they went obviously on strike, they withdrew their labour, used their strongest weapon, and demanded better pay, shorter working hours, an end to precarious working conditions. And this strike involved hundreds of thousands of workers right across Britain from all backgrounds, British labour and migrant labour. And of course, it was successful. One of those involved in the strike would be familiar to people who've watched The Royal Family. Ricky Tomlinson, well-known comedian, actor, and a former plasterer. He was actually part of a group known as the Shrewsbury 24, a group of trade unionists who were convicted in the 1970s for picketing during that national strike. And as well as being an outstanding comedian and an excellent actor, Ricky Tomlinson would be known for his outspoken political views.
My arse. Mrs. Thatcher, where you're going in a few years' time, you won't have to worry about coal, because it'll be bloody roasting where you're going. And I hope the miners have a bloody day out when it happens, because I'll be with them having a pint. I don't think that'll make final cut.
Now, what that shows is that you actually can take part of what the bosses make if you're organised and if you work together. Now, no history would be complete, in my opinion, without linking it to the present day. And related to this story, there's a lovely little connection, because I think it's fair to say that living standards have been falling and pay and conditions are falling in relation to inflation, not just in Britain, but in Ireland as well, for over a generation at this point. And the charge against that is being led by second and third generation Irish people. So if we look at Sharon Graham, she's the leader of the Unite Trade Union. And Sharon, her mother is from Abbeyfield, County Limni. The leader of the RMT Trade Union now is Eddie Dempsey, proud working class Londoner, but from Irish stock as well. And Eddie is a fearless communicator and an outstanding leader of workers. And he's taken over from Mick Lynch. And Mick Lynch, of course, his father was from Cork, from Kirkig, and his mother was from Crossmaglen. So there's an amazing kind of a link between the experiences that were detailed in this song and that era, and the fact that now the charge for better pay, for better conditions, and for a better share for workers is being led by people with not just Irish surnames, but Irish blood in them. And this is something that links all of this story together. So Sinead Kharja, that's it for episode 7. In this episode, I got to do with something I love, which is looking at a ballad, tearing it apart, finding the history, finding the connections in the past and in the present, which link to that song. Ballads are ordinary people's history. They're the way that we convey feelings, the way that we can convey occasions, stories, songs, heroes, martyrs, etc. So if I've done my job right, you listen to those versions of those songs and compare and contrast, and maybe hear them with a different ear. And maybe you listen to other ballads and other songs and hear a story or a bit of history that you hadn't heard before. Also, Accordia, just a thought, we should look at labour, the work that's done, a little bit differently. We should look at it with more value. So we live in a society that glorifies the entrepreneur and glorifies the big businesses and puts them on a pedestal and treats them as gods. And perhaps that's always been the case. It's been since day one. But the reality of the situation is that nothing gets done without the labour. Those people who work by hand or by brain every day to create and to keep our society functioning, whether it's caring for people, whether it's building, or whether it's the big infrastructural projects that were mentioned, we'll say, in the ballad Building Up and Tearing England Down. Mick Lynch is a fantastic communicator who gets that across. And I've no doubt that with Sharon, Eddie and Mick at the helm of the trade union movement in Britain, that there will be a kind of an echo, kind of a Navvy's revenge. And before I leave you with them, Accordia, please follow me on Undercover Irish at Instagram. Or if you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with a friend, family, or anyone you think that might be interested in history like this. Accordia gur míle maithagad as uachta lum. Thank you very much for being with me on this episode, and I look forward to speaking to you as soon as possible. Rigling a cháirde agus berigí bua.
Where has these decades of individualism left us? Where has it left us? Mass privatisation and profiteering, poverty and homelessness, low-paid jobs and a crumbling infrastructure, billionaires and food bags, and phony fiscal rules that they make up, and austerity. And friends, let's not forget the old blame games. A billionaire Prime Minister accusing migrants in small boats of being responsible for our decline.
I was brought up in an environment where the union was king. My dad was a shop steward. He'd come from Ireland, like my mum. We were brought up in that environment. I grew up on a council estate in Paddington up the road, which council flats. And if you went there in 1970 or 1975 or 1965, most people in that environment would be manual workers in a trade union environment, even in London, or working under trade union control, if you like, in smaller factories. So that's what we grew up in. And politics in our house was a big thing. Arguing it through. I was one of 5 kids, and everyone was articulate. I've got brothers in the construction trade, but one of my brothers is a teacher. My sister was a nurse. My wife's a nurse. That's just the environment we come from. In some ways, the skilled working class, that sort of background, and that's just what we grew up in. We are socialists.
And as you say, both your mum and dad were Irish. Is your Irishness important to you? Would you like to see unification one day?
Absolutely. I believe in a united Ireland. Absolutely.
And we've got the media against us. We've got the multinational corporations against us. We've got the government against us. But we're saying bring it on. We're not frightened here. If you want to take us on, we'll fight them.